It's now been 50 years since the last time there was a human on the moon. The last mission was Apollo 17 in 1972, and we haven't been back since. In this video, let's take a look at what that final mission actually did while it was on the moon, and then talk about why we haven't been back to the lunar surface for half a century. Apollo 17 was a record-breaking mission in many ways. It launched on December 7th, 1972 from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the astronauts splashed back down to Earth in the Pacific Ocean on December 19th. This makes it the longest crewed lunar landing mission at 12 days and 14 hours. And the mission also broke a few other records too, which we'll cover throughout this video. The astronauts on board Apollo 17 were Commander Eugene Cernan and Lunar Module pilot Harrison Schmitt, who both walked on the moon, and Command Module pilot Ronald Evans, who orbited the moon while the other two landed, and holds the record for the longest time orbiting the moon at 6 days and 4 hours, along with the related record for most number of orbits of the moon at 75. That said, he actually shares those records with 5 mice that were taken on the mission to study the effects of cosmic rays on their bodies. They were nicknamed Phi, Phi, Pho, Phom, and Phui, and I like to think Evans became fond of them during their mutual orbits. The astronaut lineup for this mission was actually kind of contentious. How it usually worked for Apollo missions was that you had a prime crew, who you expect to fly the mission, and a backup crew that trained as well just in case anything happened that meant you had to change. If you were backup crew for one mission, you became the prime crew in 3 Apollos' time. Cernan and Evans were backup crew for Apollo 14, along with a guy called Joe Engle, and Harrison Schmitt was part of the backup crew for Apollo 15. He would have flown on Apollo 18, but along with 19 and 20, that was cancelled after some issues with the earlier Apollo missions, like the Apollo 1 fire and the Apollo 13 abort. If you'd be interested in a video about the cancelled or troubled Apollo missions, then please let me know in the comments down below, because those would be super fun videos to make. Anyway, Apollo 18 was originally expected to focus more on science while on the moon, and Schmitt was a professional geologist as well as an astronaut. After 18 was cancelled, NASA was under pressure to send a scientist on 17, and hence Schmitt got the nod over Engle to visit the moon. After all that, the mission launched on a Saturn V rocket. It arrived at lunar orbit about 3.5 days later, and the lunar lander touched down another day later on December 18th, in a place called the Taurus Littrow Valley on the east side of the moon. The outward journey went pretty much perfectly, and apparently the biggest problem they had was that they forgot their scissors, which in space you need for pretty much everything, including eating. Although, I must say, if forgotten scissors are the biggest problem you have on your way to the moon, then that sounds like a good launch to me. En route, they also took one of the most famous photos of all time, the so-called blue marble. It's become a symbol of environmental movements around the globe, and is just a stunning reminder of the fragility of Earth, hanging there in space. I can't put into words exactly what makes this photo so special, but if you want to see me try, let me know in the comments. The landing spot they used was chosen for a few reasons. The terrain looked easy enough for the astronauts to move around on, and they could collect samples of highland material, because a landslide had brought rocks down to where they could land. It also offered a chance to study rocks from relatively recent volcanic activity on the moon. I say relatively recent, but it was still 3 billion years ago. But that is pretty recent on planetary body timescales. Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt then spent about 3 days on the surface of the moon, sleeping in the lunar module and taking part in 3 moonwalks. They spent 22 hours and 4 minutes outside of the module on the surface, another record, and in total brought about 115 kilograms of moon rocks and soil back to Earth. They did loads of science while on the surface too, beyond just collecting samples to bring back to Earth. They took with them the ALSEP, the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, just as each mission after Apollo 11 had done. This contained a bunch of nuclear-powered experiments that were to be placed and readied by the astronauts, and then left on the moon. For Apollo 17, these included a heat flow experiment to measure the rate of heat flow from the interior of the moon, a lunar surface gravimeter to measure any alterations in the lunar gravity field at the site where they landed, a lunar atmospheric composition experiment to start to understand what the very thin lunar atmosphere is made from, a lunar seismic profiling experiment to collect nearby seismic activity, and finally a lunar ejector and meteorites experiment to measure the energy and velocity of dust particles. Most of these experiments were brand new for Apollo 17, but the heat flow experiment had previously flown on Apollos 13, 15, and 16, although only actually worked successfully on 15. All of these things were left on the lunar surface and operated remotely for a long time, although any ones that were still operating were switched off on September 30th, 1977 due to budgetary reasons. That reason being they didn't have any budget left. Importantly, they achieved some of these things by using the Lunar Roving Vehicle. It's a moon car. This wasn't the first mission to take a moon car. Apollos 15 and 16 did too, and they built 4 of them, so 18 would have taken one too, but that one ended up being used for spare parts. I just think it's so cool that humanity landed what is basically a car on the moon. It's one thing to shoot a car into space, it's much more impressive to land it on the moon. To do this, the rover folded up, and then pretty much automatically unfolds as the astronauts pull it out of the lander. It's so awesome that this is real footage. With the rover, as you might guess by now, the team set a new lunar record for the furthest distance away from the lander during moon activities, at a pretty impressive 7.6 kilometers. In total, they drove the thing for about 4 hours and 26 minutes, traveling 35.7 kilometers. Although the very first thing they actually did with the rover was break it. Not critically, a hammer got caught and broke off a fender, but they fashioned a fix by taping a map over the wheel. Innovation at its finest. Sadly, that rover, along with almost everything else not needed to take off, was left on the moon, and only the very top part of the lunar module actually left the surface to bring those astronauts home. Interestingly, Kernan apparently loved to tell people about the last words that humans have ever spoken on the moon. While sat in the lunar module, about 20 seconds before they left the moon, he said,
"Let's get this mother out of here."
Iconic and almost as memorable as Armstrong's first words on the moon in 1969. Liftoff from the moon went really well, and the hardest part was then docking back with the command module that had been orbiting the moon all this time. On this module, for the last 3 days, Ronald Evans had been doing loads of science too. As well as looking after the mice, he ran a lunar sounder that beamed electromagnetic pulses towards the lunar surface to help make a geological model of the moon down to about 1.3 kilometers. He also had control of a mapping camera, panoramic camera, a laser altimeter, and an infrared scanning radiometer to make a temperature map of the moon. This can be useful for understanding things like variations in crust thickness and seeing volcanic activity. And there was also a far ultraviolet spectrometer too. This was used to study UV radiation that came from the sun and bounced off of the lunar surface. During the return journey, Evans actually performed a spacewalk in deep space, one of only 3 of these to ever occur, in order to transfer film cassettes full of data and footage from the science module to the command module, which was the only part of the craft that actually returned to Earth. Actually, you can see all the stuff they left on the moon in this photo, taken by NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2011. This is the scientific equipment. Here is the lander, and you can even see the moon rover down here. The 3 astronauts safely, if violently, returned back to Earth on December 19th, and just one question remains in a lot of people's minds. If we could go to the moon in the 60s and 70s, then why haven't we been back since? The easy answer to that is money. It's incredibly expensive to do these things. It was justified in the 60s because the US was involved in the space race and viewed it as essential to win that race. Pretty much the whole country was working on this project, and they got it done very quickly, but at huge cost, both monetary and human. The safety of the Apollo missions was not as good as it could have been. Just look at the avoidable deaths during that Apollo 1 fire. When we do it again, it needs to be safer, and that will cost more. We have the technology to do this. It is possible, but it still costs a lot of money. And in the US, this is a political risk. NASA is funded by Congress, and it is sometimes hard for them to assign enormous budgets for missions that will fly in decades' time, when the president signing it off almost certainly won't be there anymore. If the public thinks NASA is wasting money, that could be pretty bad for a re-election campaign. Beyond money, creating a sustained presence on the moon will be way harder than just visiting for 3 days anyway. To build a moon base, a huge problem is dust on the moon. It's super fine and gets absolutely everywhere, and it will ruin everything, especially electronics. Obvious problems are also getting enough air to breathe and mining material to actually build stuff with. But even harder to overcome is the low gravity. Humans are built for 1 Earth's worth of gravity, and the moon only has about 1/6 of that. It's bad for your spine, and it's bad for your eyes especially, and is a much harder thing to solve for a long-term moon presence than just breathing air. I am actually fascinated to see how a moon base will be developed over the coming decades. The Apollo astronauts and NASA knew that Apollo 17 would be the last moon mission for quite a while when it took place, but they had no idea it would take this long for us to start going back. They were even expecting missions to Mars with astronauts to start in the 1980s. But hopefully the success of Artemis 1 is the beginning of a human return to the moon, maybe even the beginning of a sustained presence on the moon. I really hope that in just a few years' time, we'll be celebrating the 13th and beyond human landing on the moon. Give me your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you'd like to see more videos about the Apollo missions, especially as we continue to talk about Artemis and humanity's return to the moon. Until next time, stay safe, team. I'll see you soon. Bye!